Cool, thanks. And just, I guess, for anyone who doesn't want to be on the recording, you can mute or stop your video at this point.
Thanks for that. I'm going to rely on Danny and Erica to keep me straight for this Zoom. Otherwise, I'm liable to just carry on. So yeah, my plan for this morning, do a little bit on the PowerPoint and then hopefully jump into this interactive piece where we're hoping that you'll upload a photo of your own tree and that I'll use these really sweet annotation. Hang on, this is the draw. There we go. No. Okay, I'll figure that out when it comes to it. But I'm hoping that we get to use this so we can all look at the photos and the cuts and things at the same time. So please pop those in the chat when you get the chance. That would be great. As I said before, we're probably not going to get to every single person's photo, but hopefully we'll get through a range of styles so that you're armed and ready to work on your own trees, as I mentioned. I also want to note that there are a lot of experienced pruners who are listening in this morning. So I welcome your input. Please use the chat for any comments or additions that you'd like to make or questions that you have. And at pauses or breaks, I'll try and go through the chat and see if we can talk about some of those things. And when we get to the interactive tree part, that might be an opportunity for us to unmute maybe and talk a little bit more. Okay, are there any questions up until this point? I don't see any in the chat, but I do see a couple of really great photos already, so that's wonderful. I guess I'd like to get started by talking about the mechanism of tree growth, because that's quite important. So let's see if I can. Haha, okay, so tree growth. Tree growth is controlled by hormones. Basically, bud break is led by a hormone called cytokinins, and it moves from the roots up into the highest point of the tree in the spring. And when that bud starts to grow, it produces another hormone, and that hormone trickles back down with the aid of gravity and suppresses all the growth below it. So why is that important? Well, lower branches are going to be less vigorous and better for fruit. All the vertical branches are going to be competing with the cytokinins to be the highest. And so those are going to exhibit a lot of green vegetative growth and not a lot of fruit set. And so if you have an unpruned fruit, that might be kind of hard to manage. So as you go into pruning, you're going to be looking at training your tree basically to manage this hormone growth, managing where you have the vertical shoots, where you have the horizontal and lateral branches, where you have your fruit spurs. Okay, very important to start. If you understand why, it gets easier. Tree form. So there's a couple of forms. I have two types highlighted here, this slide and the next slide. And I'm going to use a little bit of terminology here. So some terms like central leader, this is a tree form style. We have, let's see if I can annotate again here. This might be important. Draw. Is this going to work? Yeah, okay. Central leader. This is your central leader. One tall main branch going straight up. Then we have some lateral branches here, here, here. There's more, but that's just an example. These lateral branches, horizontal branches, you can kind of use those terms interchangeably. They set what's known as the scaffolding. So just like the rungs of a ladder or scaffolding on the side of the building, this structure of the tree, you want to set that, and it typically remains unchanged as the tree grows. So getting started with a good, strong training system right off the bat will really help as you work to prune your trees later on. So when So on the right here, we just have more, basically an example of the same thing. Central leader, nice branching coming off on the side here. These are all at a really excellent angle out from the main trunk. And the ideal angle is probably between 45-ish degrees, can be as low as 90. Probably you don't want it any higher than 60 degrees. And I'm talking about the branch angle here, which would be this little narrow angle. Okay, next, let's see. Oh, I have to clear that, gosh. Okay, clear drawings. Great, so sorry, this part might get a little bit painful. We have another form here called the open bush. In this case, there isn't one clear central leader. The farmers or the orchardists have chosen, 3 to 5 main branches that are the scaffolding, and then try and maintain the branches as they come out this way at roughly the same height. This open bush form or vase form is great for stone fruit. They naturally have different branch angles, and so this one is really good because you won't be fighting the natural tendency of the tree quite as much. Gonna just clear these drawings and move along. Okay, so I wanted to take a little bit closer look at the branch here and what's important as we move forward. So in the red, what you'll see is this is pointing to different year growth of branchwood. This red here is first year growth. This one is second year growth, third year, and fourth year. And the blue is pointing to the bud scars. So there's a scar, there's a scar, there's a scar. This is showing a little marker or indication of the end of one year's growth and the start of the next year's growth. This can be helpful for you when you're pruning, when you're grafting, and you need to select only first year wood, and when you're looking to figure out what to leave and what to take. So what happens is in first year wood, you end up with only leaf buds. So they're small and flat typically, and they don't produce fruit. So this is another thing. If you have a lot of really upright vertical shoots, you're going to have a lot of leaf growth and not a lot of bud growth. Then what happens is there's some triggers on the tree that with age and with the right amount of light, these leaf buds can turn into fruit spurs or fruit buds. So here we go on the second, on this second year piece right here. This is a flower bud. You can tell a little bit more fat. Typically they have downy scales and quite round. Then as you get into the older wood here on year 3 and year 4, what we're seeing are fruit spurs. Fruit spurs are typically the most productive between years 3 and 5. And after that, they can benefit from a little bit of renewal. So if you have the kind of tree that you prune every year, but your fruit production is extremely biennial, you only get a fruit, great crop in one year, less of a good crop in the second year, you want to look at your distribution of fruit spurs. So always making sure you have a nice mix of fruit spurs and ages and not just one year wood. Now, I'm just going to check the chat here. Thus is open bush best for lightweight fruit branch loading. Oh, yeah, that's back a little bit here. I don't know how to go backwards actually. There we go. Open bush, lightweight fruit branch. Yeah, I mean, open bush can be a little bit tricky in the sense that the stronger branches are typically at wider branch angles. But I think open bush, you know, can handle quite a bit of fruit load. It's a common shape in commercial farms too, where they really load up the fruit. It's pretty intense. So one of the challenges I see with open bush, actually, and I haven't mentioned this yet, we haven't talked about lighter airflow, but one of the common challenges I see in backyard growers is that the fruit grows outwards all the time, outwards and upwards, and then the center ends up being cleared out of crossing branches or just backwards pointing branches. And then there's this whole huge gap in the center of the tree, which ends up being unused, which actually has great light access and could produce wonderful fruit. So I think with this form, you just have to be careful that you're using the whole canopy correctly and maximizing that. Okay, moving along. Back to here. Okay, what to use to prune. So we've talked a little bit about setting the tree. You know, if you're going to look certain styles, shapes, and forms. We've talked about what to look for in the branch, you know, your buds versus your fruit spurs. And this is what I use to prune. They're a little bit muddy. Sorry about that. This is a bit realistic. What I have here is two styles of bypass pruners. So these are single beveled blades. With the loppers, you can get ones that crunch down onto a flat, you know, one of them's pointed, one of them's flat. I don't really like that style. It tends to crush the wood and make a more damaging cut. So the bypass style makes the cleanest cut. I also have here a brand of saw called Silky. This is a wonderful saw, Japanese style saw, and it's not foldable, which just adds a lot of rigidity and makes it really, really great for working on almost any branch I can imagine. Between these three tools, you're probably set. Okie dokie. So when I'd like to pruning a little bit more. And the reason for this, the reason why I'm talking a little bit about these mechanisms, you know, right at the start about the vegetative growth, you know, and the hormones, and now why are you pruning? Because really, if you can hold these goals in your mind while you look at your tree, what to cut and where to cut makes a lot of sense. So instead of just following some rules, this is going to allow you to adapt, you know, to any tree you might see in front of you. So, you know, primarily at the simplest level, you can prune for tree health. So you're going to cut out dead and diseased wood. And then you can prune for light penetration and disease prevention. So you can remove crossing branches that might overlap. You can thin branches out in order to improve airflow. And so, yeah, I say that that's the single best tool against disease. And it really is. If you are able to dry out your leaves and your bark, you know, more quickly, that is going to reduce habitat for all of those things that plague our trees, the canker, the scab, you know, mites, anything that you might have on your trees, and anything that we probably do have, to be honest. You know, warm and wet is sort of the habitat for all of those funguses and bacterias. And so if you can have dry, that means you have to do a lot less work down the road, and your tree is going to be naturally a lot more healthy. So why prune? The next thing I want to talk about is pruning goal here. So if you've got a young tree or an established tree. So on a young tree, you're going to be pruning for form and structure mainly. You want a strong main leader to encourage branching. You're going to shorten your laterals to encourage strengthening of your wood. You're going to train the branches to the desired shape. So that goes into, you know, light penetration, that goes into airflow. You're setting those structural the scaffolding, like I mentioned before. And you can do that if they're not angled correctly and you have a young tree. You can do that with tie downs, you can do that with spacers. And the more you do with the younger tree, the easier it gets later on. Then with an older tree, you're going to want to prune mainly for these, for these goals. And you want to think about maintaining a fruit canopy with different ages of wood. So you don't all want 1 year shoots. You want a nice balance of blossoming wood, spurs that are fresh. Maybe you do some regeneration, you make some bigger cuts to help regenerate. So you always have a mix of, say, like 1 year branches all the way up to 5 or 7 year branches. And that's going to help with the biennial issues. I'm going to check the chat here. Oh, I think we're good. Okay. How to cut. So I know a lot of you know this already. What we have here on the left are a couple of good cuts. So here we have the goal of trying to make the wound as small as possible. With a lot of your cuts, you want to make a slight diagonal cut. You want to do it just above the bud. And then all of the growth energy of the tree is going to be directed to this bud. And as you can see here, very similar cutting, making a pruning cut on 1 year wood. But in this example, I've left a long stub. There's no buds here to take any of the tree's energy, and I've made a flat cut. So you never want to leave long stubs. Part of the reason for this is that this is going to die back, and that little tiny, section becomes a host for pests and disease, which we're trying to avoid. Same here, I've made this cut down here, kind of long, and I cut deeply into the bark tissue of the tree. So again, I've opened up this wound that is longer and bigger. It takes a while to heal. On the far left, what you can see is a thinning cut here. And what I've done is cut close to the branch. However, there is this branch collar that's left. And when you look closely at your tree, you'll be able to see this little raised ring of the branch collar. And that actually has some really helpful growth cells and some protective cells in this collar. And so that's going to help your cut heal over really quickly. So just as we go into the pruning, this is one of those things that you need to keep in mind every cut you make. Is it angled? Is it close to a bud? Am I leaving a stub? Okay, maybe I'll go further down. Is this going to be a clean cut? Just keep those things in mind if you can. I'm going to check the chat here. It looks like there's a couple. Photos. Wonderful. Okay, so types of cuts. We have mainly heading and thinning cuts. So what am I going to do here? Thinning cuts. I did mention that a little bit before, and the next slide shows you a photo of what I mean. Most of the cuts can be divided into these two types. A thinning cut is going to take the branch back right out at the base. And this is really good for renewal. It's good for clearing your tree. And of course, the fewer cuts you make on your tree in a given year, the better. And usually what happens is if you make one cut in the wintertime, you might get 3 to 4 shoots coming up from that spot. So the more you're able to make fewer cuts while still improving your tree, the better it is for you, because there'll be fewer shoots coming out of that space. So that's why thinning cuts can be really great. Heading cuts are slightly different. Heading cuts, you're cutting back a little portion of the branch, maybe by 1/3, for example. This is going to cause a little bit of stimulation in the branch. It's great for stiffening up weak branches, and it's great to encourage more branching. So heading cuts are great for young trees. So here's an example of what I mean by heading cuts and thinning cuts. And this is on a pear. So what we have here is 2-year wood right here. And then we have a whole bunch of shoots. This pear is just going nuts. And we have a whole bunch of shoots going on. So what we've done here is used heading cuts here, 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 and here. So I've cut those branches back by 2/3 in this case. And I have thinned, this central area is quite congested. I have thinned that out by taking out 1, 2, 3, 4 branches right where the branch meets, or I guess where I could say the shoot meets the branch. Sorry, a lot of these terms really overlap. Okay, so this is an example of heading cuts. They're on an angle. They're pretty close to the next bud down. And here we have the thinning cuts right there. One thing that I also want to mention in this case, for this vertical branch, I have left this particular shoot much higher and taller than the rest. I'd like to encourage that to take all of the growth, the vertical growth. These have all been cut back pretty significantly because I don't want them to put on more vegetative growth. I'd like to shorten them, actually encourage them to be laterals and be productive fruit branches. So this is just an example of how you might handle that vegetative growth thing. One strong straight branch, and then encourage a few more branches there. Great. When to prune and when to heading cuts and thinning cuts whenever you prune, it doesn't really matter. Winter pruning, what we're talking about mostly right now, is going to stimulate more growth. So when you make one cut, you're going to end up with several cuts, several shoots rather, that come up in its place. So it's stimulating a lot of growth. This is great when you're working with young trees, or when you're want a high production tree and you want lots of fruit every year. You can get in there and really renew your branches. Make sure you have that good mixture of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old wood. Summer pruning, I would say, is suitable for when you have a mature tree. When you want less vigor, espalier is a great example. If you have a tree that has filled its space, you don't want it to get any bigger, you're going to cut the shoots out in the summer. When you prune in the summer, you're not going to get a lot of growth coming out of those fresh cuts. Okay, at this point, I'm going to start looking at some pictures and pulling apart, or highlighting rather, some of the things we've talked about in photo form so we can see them in a bunch of different scenarios. Are there any questions about the pruning basics? I mean, I feel like I probably just whipped through that. So there's a lot going on. Please take a moment to put any questions you have in the chat, and we'll just see if we can help answer some questions.
There's one in the chat right now, Kate, if you want to look at that, from Edina. Yeah. Okay, so this question from Edina, I think folks can see, says, to keep your tree at a certain height, when do you cut the central leader and how much do you cut off? Okay, you'll cut off the amount you need to cut in order to keep it at the height you want. You can be quite tough with trees. And so if your tree is 12 feet tall and that's as high as you'd like it, you can make that cut right then and there at that height so it doesn't get any taller. If you make the cut in the summer, you might, for several summers in a row, you're going to start reducing vigor in that upper shoot area. If you make the cut in the winter, you're going to get a lot of shoots out of that space, and maybe that's what you want to encourage new growth. you can still maintain the tree height and cut all those shoots off. Okay. Do you need to apply anything to the cuts to prevent disease from entering the tree? This question was around applying topical dressings, I guess, to any of the tree cuts. That has been more or less disproven in the last 15, 20 years. For the most part, the way to address the fresh cuts is to prune when it's dry and let the tree heal itself. So if you're pruning when it's wet, it's easier to spread any, bacteria or whatever from cut to cut. So if you prune when it's dry, one other thing that you can do for tree health when you're pruning is not prune if there's going to be a really hard freeze. So trees are extremely sensitive for about 48 hours after pruning, and they are their hardiness is a little bit reduced for up to a week after pruning. So on a weekend like this, I think this is a great weekend to be out there pruning. During that hard freeze we had at Christmas, there's not really much benefit to, even though it was dry, there's not much benefit to pruning during that hard freeze. And that'll give the tree time to heal itself. Is pruning figs any different than apple or pear? Yeah, pruning figs are super different. I think we'll take time to talk about Mediterranean fruit near the end. Can you prune back small laterals and have them turn into fruit spurs in the coming year? I think so. If I'm understanding the question around can you prune back small laterals and have them turn into fruit spurs, as long as that branch has enough light, is getting good light access, you can encourage fruit spurs on any lateral style branch. We have a question here around double cutting big branches. So I would use my saw for anything over 1.5 inches probably. And if the branch is quite heavy, this is where you might look at cutting it twice or using an undercut. And the reason goes right back to that photo where I shared, the ripped bark on one of those pruning cuts. You just don't want a long, ugly cut with, where you've ripped the bark halfway down the tree. So if that means taking some of the weight off the outer branch and then moving to cut the remaining branch at the trunk or at the intersection, then that's fine. If it means doing a bit of an undercut first and then going and doing your bigger cut, both of those would be effective techniques. It's just whether or not you're going to see, if your branch is so heavy, whether or not you're going to try and prevent the bark from ripping. Okay, I think we're going to try and do 2 more questions and then move on. This, so just reiterating, if you have an espaliered fruit tree and it has already filled its space, then summer pruning is ideal. If you have an espaliered fruit tree and it's still growing to fill its space, now is the time to cut. Okay, that is, there's to reduce biennial fruiting. Do you make any attempt to remove older fruiting spurs? Sometimes you can. To address the specific question, to reduce biennial fruiting, I think are going to go further along into the photos and talk a little bit more about renewal. I would say that removing older spurs, 1 spur at a time, isn't the most effective solution for biennial fruiting necessarily. removing spurs, sort of one at a time, or branch on individuals on each branch would probably be most effective in reducing crowding, or help you not need to thin your fruit quite as much as in the summertime. Where you can reduce your biennial fruiting primarily comes from using renewal cuts. So big thinning cuts so that you're always encouraging multiple years of growth. Let's see if I have some better photos of that as we move along. Okay, thank you for the questions, everyone. This was great. Okie doke. So, on to the next. Just highlighting what a great young tree can look like. Okay, some basic rules to hold in your brain when you get started. You're going to want to thin out dead and diseased wood first. Probably not a ton of that on this tree. You're going to want to remove branches that cross through the tree or cross under or go straight down. So let's annotate again because I can see a few. From this angle, this branch looks like it comes up through the tree. However, because this is a photo and it's only 2D, if I walked around the tree, it might actually be going out at a different angle that's helpful. From this angle, we'll call that a crossing branch. It is crossing from the lowest branch up through 1, 2, 3 layers of scaffolding, really. So that can go. In this young tree, you're going to spend a lot of time shortening laterals. So cutting here, perhaps cutting here, in order to encourage the branches to stiffen up. Another rule of thumb is don't take too much off the tree in 1 year. So the more you cut, the more shoots get produced. And also it can be quite stressful. So if you're cutting 50% of the canopy off, you can expect the tree to go nuts next year and you'll have made a lot of work for yourself. So don't take more than 1/4 to 1/3 of the canopy per year. And just keep in mind, every cut you make, nice clean cuts, no stubs left behind. Okie dokie. Let's clear the drawings and move forward. I want to highlight this young tree. So this is an example of a northern spy, actually. And here's a before and after of what pruning a young tree could look like. This tree is about maybe 8 years old, 9 years old at this point. And it's hard to tell from the photo, but it's about 10 feet tall. What we have on the northern spy is a lot of wildly upright growth, and not every tree is going to be like that. But the main goals are very similar here. We've used heading cuts, taken off a lot of the growth. But what I have done with the heading cuts is you can see that there's a little bit of 1-year wood left behind. There's 1/3 of every branch sort of left behind. And that's because I want to leave about 3 to 4 buds behind and encourage those to turn into fruiting spurs. And from this angle, you can see a couple of fruiting spurs, like that one is a fruiting spur and that one. So photos are less than ideal, but we're starting to get some great scaffolding here and we're starting to get some really nice fruiting spurs. Okay, I'm going to clear this and move along. Okay, this is another example of heading and thinning. So this is a pear tree. And what we can see here is this pear tree. Pears are tricky. Pears and northern spies have a ton of upright growth. So pretty much all of these shoots are coming up at a pretty vertical angle, but there isn't a lot of vertical vigor here. There's a lot of fruit spurs, so it's pretty easy to tackle. What I've done is, in this case, there's 2 branches doing pretty much the same thing. And on the photo on the right, you can see that I have taken out 1. So I've used a thinning cut and I've headed back a little bit. So where I've had 2 of some things, you know, I've looked at the idea of spacing. What do I need to do to space out the fruit on this branch? And so I've held that in mind. In this example, after I have pruned the branch, you can also see that there's vertical wood right here. If this was a vigorous leafy shoot, that would definitely go. But because this is entirely composed of fruit spurs, I actually don't have a problem with leaving that behind, because a pear hanging right here probably get a lot of light and ripen really nicely. So the idea of sort of holding all these concepts in your head as you move through the tree, you know, how do you want your fruit to ripen? Is there good airflow? Is this crowding? Is this shading? So in this case, when there's 2 branches side by side, they're crowding, but you know, this older spur, I can leave that for now, and next year or the year after, I can thin that out. I tend to leave more than I take and come back in the following year. And if it's still not right, then, you know, you can cut that out at that time. But what's really important here is that even though, you know, some of these shoots might be kind of upright, they might be kind of less than ideal, I don't want to take all of those out, because then I would be left with, you know, 1, 2, maybe 2 feet of actually no fruiting wood whatsoever. And, you know, just a few fruit at the end here. So I don't want to be so strongly pinned to those goals of the wood has to be 45 degrees or exactly that. I want to make sure that if fruit and tree health is my goal, which in this case it is, well, I'm gonna leave some of these branches behind, because I'd like some fruit there, and it doesn't detract from the tree in any way to have a few of these branches here. Okay, I'm gonna clear these and move to the next slide. Okay, so a few more samples of some photos. It's funny, I have a lot of pears highlighted here. Okay, so what we have is on the right, another example where you can see an older pear tree and a lot of fruit spurs. So pears can be very tricky to navigate because of how vertical they can be. This particular tree, that vertical element, you know, that farmers decided that they want to stop it at 2 feet off the main scaffolding branch. That's fine, that's their choice. And what they've got here is, you know, oh, I want to go back, previous, there we are. What they've got here is, you know, spurs really nicely spaced every 6 inches along the whole branch, and, you know, spur, spur, spur. And so they're getting an amazing fruit production, as well as great airflow and great light penetration through the whole part of the tree. So I think that they're accomplishing their goals really nicely here in that photo. I have also, on this photo on the left, I primarily took this to show that things, you can manage a tree, you know, for fruit production, and it doesn't have to look perfect, because trees are very natural. And so this has a lot of cuts here, really nice cuts that are close to the branch. Probably yellow isn't the right color here, I'll do that twice. Close to the branch, it's not very crowded. It's kind of hard to see from this angle, but these 2 branches were actually, you know, 8 inches apart. So they're filling, each branch here where there's fruit is filling a nice airspace. And, you know, there's even a fruit spur right here. So that's great. What I would maybe do is this particular cut here could probably be slightly closer. Wow, I'm just really scribbling all over that. Let's try again. Make it a little bit more clear. This particular cut could probably be slightly closer to the tree. But other than that, you know, this is just an example of a really nicely managed pear tree. And the trees can look a lot of different ways, essentially. Okie dokie, next slide. Oh yeah, this one is wild. Oh, this is another style of pruning. And if it works for you, it's totally okay to prune like this. It's what we've got here is sort of the annual buzz cut. And what happens is all of these 1-year shoots are pruned out every winter. And what remains are these great little nubs. And these nubs are full of fruiting spurs. And what's really interesting about this is sort of the first photo that I have on here that shows an older tree that isn't sort of central leader shaped, but there's still good space and good lateral branching, good airflow. You know, there's a branch over here taking this area of sunlight and airflow. There's a branch way over here, and all these little guys are really spread out nicely within that. So if this is your style of pruning, that's great. Carry on. Just make sure that you leave fruiting spurs behind, that you don't go back to the main lateral branch every year. You can see that really well on this photo, actually. You can see these little nubs left behind that are holding the fruiting spurs. And one other really important tip with this style of pruning is that you're going to need to use renewal or thinning cuts periodically. So you're going to want to, when these little nubs get too crowded, you know, say there's 7 little nubs in this one clump, you're going to want to cut some of those out, maybe down to 3, and then leave them to grow, you know, back to your old style. So you're always going to do some renewal of your older wood. Even in this style of pruning, you're going to use renewal of your older wood, thinning cuts on your older wood in here. Okay. Great. So I have, oh yeah, this is great. I have some photos of tree renovations, and they look at sort of the whole tree, not just little components. I wonder if we can look at some photos of people's trees first before we get into this.
So Kate, I did look at the ones that have been submitted, and most of them I think are pretty good in terms of the light factor and being able to pick out branches and things. And there aren't too many, so I would say maybe just start with one per person who submitted, skipping mine. Mine was just an example, and you can use mine at the end if you still want some more, but maybe start with Patrick Louis. And I emailed all of them to you as well, if that's an easier way for you to open them up.
I don't know, let's find out. Oh gosh. All right. I might just stop my screen share for 2 seconds here. Oh, I think this is going to work okay.
We can
look
still
at
see your
that.
screen share.
Okay, can you see only the PowerPoint at this point?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I now have, I'm going to, this is where technology is amazing. At this point, what you should be seeing is a photo of a tree branch. Erica, can you confirm that?
I think we currently can see Patrick's photo of a branch, and your cursor is moving around on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I think what might be easier at this point is if folks have questions or comments, unmute and just hop in. Patrick, would you like to unmute and do you have any specific questions about this branch?
Hi, Katie. I'm a real novice. Any help you can give me? We didn't produce hardly any fruit last year. I've always had somebody else help me prune the trees. So, and they've retired since. So I'm a little lost.
Well, it actually looks really good. What I can see is from here, there's some decent structural branches, and that seems great to me. I can also see a lot of fruit spurs. So the potential for fruit is there. And what I do want to do is reassure you, because last year was kind of a poor fruit year for everyone. You can fix biennial tendency to some degree, by your pruning, but also sometimes there is just bad years and it's primarily weather driven. If it's cold while the fruit trees are blooming, that makes a big impact. So that's what happened to a lot of trees last year on the island. Okay, getting started in here. Well, I think we might start, maybe I'll change my color. I wonder if red's going to stand out nicely. Start with a little bit of cleaning up for airflow. So at this point, some things that I can see from this photo is that I can't see through this branch very well. It just looks a little bit crowded, like there's a little bit of overlap. So, maybe a branch like this. And again, it's tricky to tell from the angle of the photo, and I think that's going to happen to us a lot today. But that branch to me looks like maybe it's crossing with this branch somehow. And so, crossing branch can come out, with no hesitation. I also see in the center, so I'm kind of looking at a couple of main branches, and it looks like there's one back there. In the center here, this just looks very, very crowded. And I would start by using thinning cuts in this case. So fewer, bigger cuts that might address some of that airflow issue. So perhaps this branch can come out. This one, seems to do some kind of an arch. So to me, that looks like it's taking up a lot of different airflow zones. And what you might want to do is, cut that off here so this branch is in its own zone, that it doesn't come down and take up other airspace. So yeah, in this case, I would look at thinning cuts. What's another cut that looks like it might be a little bit challenging? This branch here seems to come pretty far over, and I'd look at cutting that back. But primarily in this case, I would look at, some bigger thinning cuts, maybe 3 to 4 cuts in this particular area, no more than that, and make sure they're all kind of about 1 inch in diameter. And if you follow that around your tree, that would probably be enough for 1 year. You probably wouldn't want to do too much more than that.
Kate, while you're on this photo, can you talk a little bit about the really fuzzy looking few, like we have really clear shots of some nice velvety new growth, and what you might do with some of those branches that are kind of going upward, but they look like they might develop into fruit buds?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I can kind of see something nice happening here. In this case, with the older tree, I would do a lot less heading cuts, a lot, not too many little fussy cuts, because that's going to produce a lot of shoots for you in the future. And unless they're going straight up and they're blocking other things, I might leave them in place because there's a lot going on in here that you want to tackle first. This branch over here, I can kind of see going up pretty high. So in that case, you know, a great example, a great time to use a heading cut, you know, cut that back. You want to cut to a nice outward facing bud. So that means that the bud that you leave behind, you'd really like it to be facing in the direction you want more growth. So if the bud that you leave behind is facing downwards, you're likely to get a downward facing bud. If the bud is facing upwards, well, that might just go straight up vertically. And so you don't really want that either. So when you're cutting your nice first year woods with header cuts, or you're making a nice cut like right in here, you want a nice outward facing bud. I think that's probably, in reality, that's probably outward facing. Right now it looks like it's going back into the center of the tree, but I don't think it is. Yeah, Erica, does that answer the question?
Yeah, totally. Thanks.
I feel like if I can ramble a bit, so it's good to keep me on point. Patrick, do you feel like you have kind of a place to start with that?
That was great advice. Thank you so much, Kate. That was brilliant.
Yeah, and I would just keep in mind not making too many cuts in any given year.
That's the best advice. Thank you.
Okie dokes. Well, that was our first trial. Our first trial of this. How interesting. Let's see if we can do another one. What do we have here? Oh, plum, apple.
I would try maybe Michael Taylor's directly under Patrick's photo.
Yeah. Okay, great. It's gonna take a half second to download. Maybe if this is another apple, we'll work on talking about some different fruit afterwards. Why was that so hard to open? Great, I just want to check in and see if you're seeing this new photo of the tree.
Not yet.
Okay. Oh yeah, I have to new share every time. How about now?
Not yet. Oh, yeah, now we can.
Okay, interesting. There's a couple second delay. Okay, so wow, this is a really old tree. It's still going. It's still trucking. What I would work on firstly with this tree, well, I have a few ideas. Michael, was there anything you wanted to mention about the tree?
So yeah, this morning, Kate, morning, Eric, Katie, morning, Erica. This tree was fighting Douglas firs that were growing on the south side of it. It's actually growing due north at the moment, and so for 50 or 60 years, it's been trying to escape. And so we're guessing 100 years or plus on this apple tree. Last calendar year 2019, we got 3 apples after clearing the Douglas firs, and now it's taking off. This is 2021. So this is the tree I want to graft some branches off for preserving these for the future, but then lowering the load on this 45-degree trunk that's maybe 100 years old.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. Lightening the load is pretty key. So again, with the older tree, what would I start with? It's so nice to see old trees still surviving after all this time. Okay, I'm going to choose blue, I think, because it's going to stand out a bit better against the grass. First thing I would do is this looks like a stump maybe, or a piece of dead branch. I'd probably make a clean cut just to tidy that up a little bit. And then another possibility here is you could always prop the tree up. 2x4 big post of some kind can help with the weight bearing. If you don't want to do that and just let nature take its course, that's totally cool too. And then, yeah, so it just looks like there's a lot of droopy, beautiful branches here. And so the key is just going to be using, I would say, a lot of thinning cuts. And then next year, cuts to shorten the branches. So because this is taken, I can't see all of the branch structure, but to me it looks like there's probably, you know, tons of branches that go in this direction. I would look at taking out about 1/3 of those in here. So with your saw, and I'm a big fan of making fewer, bigger cuts, take out about 1/3 of the branches that are dangling down. And that might be, you know, maybe even 1/4, 15%. On these old trees, they don't show quite as much vigor, and cuts can be kind of shocking to them. So there's also not a lot of canopy in this tree. So the gentler you are, I think potentially the better. Yeah, making a couple of thinning cuts in here to lighten this load overall. And then in year 2, maybe I'll change the color here and we'll talk a little bit about what year 2 could be. Red. Year 2, you know, you might get in there and start shortening up some of these branches that are really dangling. So again, what you might find is that if you follow the basic rules of cutting out dead and diseased, that might already be your first 15%. And then to get up to 1/4 of the canopy, maybe you only make 2 more cuts. And you know, it's an old tree, so you want to be pretty gentle on it. And in the following year, you continue with that program. So check out your dead and disease first, move to some of the thinning cuts, and then maybe assess and make sure you haven't taken off too much.
Kate, I just want to jump in the first thing you said about that branch on the left. To me, it looks like it actually just bent, like it doubled back, but actually healed. And now that whole bit of growth behind it is alive. And maybe Michael knows better if that's the case or if it is just a stub. But if it is just sort of bent and then it's grown all that new growth, would you still consider that a damaged branch and take it off? Or would you allow that to continue producing fruit?
I would say it's probably pretty integral to the tree at this point. You're right, I can see behind here how this is probably more of the tree, but it's hard to say what that join looks like. I think it could be really beneficial to clean up the breakage if there is some. As for taking the whole branch off, if it's not dead, I wouldn't do it. There's not a lot going on lower down with this old tree. And that's one of the challenges with old trees, is that they're, you know, the sunlight, they're chasing the sunlight higher and higher and higher. And a lot of these branches down here are breaking off or dying due to lack of, you know, a number of things. Maybe they're suffering because of lack of light. And you have this whole area under here that's maybe 15 or 20 feet that doesn't have any producing wood for you. So if you have a nice low branch, leave it. Would be really nice to be able to pick something from a non 16-foot ladder, probably. But yeah, if it's a messy cut, clean it up and you know, apply the same principles out here to this branch, whatever that looks like, which is dead and disease first, and then a couple of thinning cuts this year, and then maybe next year look at doing the complete, you know, heading cut, trim back, that kind of thing. Okay, I actually think what I'd like to do is, since we're looking at some older trees, and the idea of multi-year projects or multi-year pruning has been introduced. I'd like to go back to the PowerPoint and just show you a couple of those photos to illustrate the idea of what multi-year projects can look like on older trees. And then we'll go back to some of the photos that have been shared. And okay, let's see here.
Kate, just quickly before you move on, are you opening them from the email that I sent you, or are you just opening them directly from the chat? Because there's a few more.
Straight from the chat.
Okay, great. So I won't bother emailing anymore.
No, I think it's working out really nicely.
Yeah, good.
From the chat, it just seems to be like a couple seconds while we wait. Okay, older tree renovations. Here's an example of an old tree. This is really interesting. It doesn't have a clear form per se, but you can see a clear skeleton coming through. So you can see a nice strong trunk, then there's a couple of laterals that set the stage. And then, you know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it stopped getting pruned and then it just went wild. And in a big old tree like this, it's important, A, not to take off too much in one go, and B, to walk away before it looks perfect. This is the hardest part. I'm going to show you how much we got done on in 1 year, and then we left it. So some of the impact that we made was in removing dead and diseased wood, and that accounted for quite a bit. Then we worked on the crowding, and we worked on getting airflow between the layers of the branches that already existed. And all of a sudden you can see through the canopy, and the airflow has been improved greatly. There is one little thing here that's a bit tricky with the older trees. A lot of this wood is what's known as blind wood, which means that it's not actually that productive branches until you get to the very end. It's quite hard to remedy that. And on big old trees, you know, where the scaffolding branches come way out, that's kind of a multi-year project to shorten them if you can and bring them back in. But for this year, you know, 1 year approach, what we did is hardly anything in and around here because it had been maintained, you know, up to 5 or 6 years ago, like I said. And we just worked on cleaning up some of this upper layering here. And now what's more apparent is the layers between the branches. So here's a branch, and then 2 feet later, there's another branch. That's a great amount of airflow between scaffolding branches. The further up we go, again, we're seeing airflow and layers between the sets of branches. What we have done is left some things that might be considered less than ideal under perfect circumstances. So from this angle, yes, it looks like this branch drops down a little bit. In 3D, it's not actually crossing quite as badly, but it is dangling down. That's something we could fix at a later time, but isn't that important right now. A lot of what we did was leave all these little hairs. There's so much up here. And you have to learn when to walk away. So those big cuts that we took out, again, pretty much only with the saw, and probably a third of the tree, which this tree could support just given how vigorous it really is. Walk away and then come back next year to do more thinning and more precise heading cuts.
There's a good question, Kate, in the chat about this particular picture. Just Claire Kennedy's asking, so would you prune this in the spring, and could you go back in the fall and do a bit more, or wait until next spring?
Okay, so this was winter pruned in February. and it was left for 1 full year. And typically fruit trees aren't pruned in the fall. We let them focus on their sort of dormancy, going dormant, and a lot of their nutrients and energy are still hanging out in the leaves in the fall. And so if we're doing any pruning in the fall, we're cutting that off the tree before it has a chance to send it back to the roots. Really interestingly, the roots are going to be storing all of the nutrients the apple or fruit tree needs to grow. So all of bud break in the following year, all of the leaf growth and the blossoms, that's all driven by the stored nutrients in the tree roots. They don't start photosynthesizing until it gets really, really warm out, like surprisingly warm. So you want as healthy roots as possible, and you want the tree to be able to store as much of its own nutrients as possible. And in that vein, that's why it can be really important to water your fruit trees in the fall, even though you think it might not be necessary. The roots are still quite active in September and October, and that's a great time to water to improve your tree health.
That's all really interesting, Kate. I'm just I'm wondering if Claire maybe meant like, would you, because you mentioned earlier about if you're pruning to a really vigorous tree, you might want to do it in the winter, but if it's a mature tree, you would maybe do it in the summer. So would you ever prune a tree twice in 1 year, in the summer and then again in the winter? Or would you want to wait again till the next summer to do another prune on a big tree like this? Is that?
I mean, I think that that's really personal choice. If I've taken off a third of the canopy in the wintertime, I might not go back to that tree for 1 full year. If it's really extremely vigorous and a young tree, and what you're focused on in the summer is taking out water sprouts, which water shoots look a lot like this, but they tend to happen right in here. I think that you could safely remove those from the center of your tree in the summer, but I tend to focus on one style of pruning or the other, not pruning too much in any given year. Yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a ramble before. I just sort of got really off topic.
No, it was really great. I just wanted to make sure Claire's.
Thank you for keeping me on topic. Okay, let's move forward into.
The next photos would be Bill Kaywood's 3 photos that were submitted, and there's an apple, plum, and a peach.
Okay, great. Let's see if there's another photo of what multi-year pruning could look like. Oh yeah, this is another example of sort of a second year prune in process. And what I think this highlights in the photo is just that trees can be a little bit wild, but there is a priority here on fruiting spurs and layering. So yeah, I mean, I think we've probably really talked a lot about years 1, 2, and layering and leaving things behind if you need to. So yeah, let's get some of those photos. Erica, you were saying the next ones were from
Bill Kaywood, it looks like, just below Michael's last photo near the top of the chat.
Okay, I think let's switch into talking about stone fruit if we can. We'll make that jump. And if anybody has questions about Mediterranean or stone fruit, we'll try and address some of those. This will just take a second to download these guys, and then I'll be able to open them up. I did see a question about watering that I can answer. Is it necessary to water older trees all summer, or how should a tree, can you get away with not watering? So many trees are, haven't been watered for years and years, and they're surviving, and that's fine. If that's how they've been trucking along for 20 years, there's no need to get into, to change that if it's out of your scope of, your ability in that year if you have a busy year. What watering does do is help reduce stress of the tree. So even if it is a very old tree and it's a dry summer, if you're watering regularly throughout the summer on that old tree, you're going to make the tree less stressed, which means it's going to set more fruit buds that will be ready to be fruit in the following year. So if all trees work, not all trees, apples work on a 2-year cycle. So you're always working with 2 years of fruit at the same time. You have this year's fruit and you have next year's fruit buds, which are being set at the same time that the fruit is growing and developing. So the more you are watering, even older, sturdy trees, the less stressed they're going to be. That might help with the biennial issue. What does regular watering mean? We have a couple of 100-year-old fruit trees, and sometimes in August, we'll get the sprinkler out for an hour and run it under the drip line of the tree. Is this an option for a lot of people? No, water is at a premium in the summer on Denman, and certainly, you want to respect that too. If it's not possible for you or your neighborhood water system, then don't do it and the tree will be fine. Okie dokie. Oh, here's a cute little plum. I have to share this screen with you and then we'll talk about plums. Bill, did you have anything that you wanted to ask or mention about these?
I'm kind of curious about the branch that's heading upwards on the right there. It's quite a bit taller than the rest of the tree. It's kind of hard to see in the photo.
Does that look like this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Bill, looks like you've got a really happy young tree. This would be where you spend time setting the structure of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
So to talk about stone fruit and Mediterranean fruit a little bit, the best time to prune isn't necessarily right now. Delay that into the spring as long as possible. So just before bud break, if you can. The warmer and drier out it is, the better for all Mediterranean and stone fruit. So just right off the bat, you're probably going to want to hold on for a month or two. Then let's make sure that you're setting sort of one trunk up to a certain point, and you're getting rid of all the little things underneath that are going to crowd or cross in the end. This isn't really a very easy color to see. Let's try that. Let's try blue. So yeah, you want to, wow, it's not any better. Shoot. Yeah, you're going to want to get rid of these lower branches right now that might take up some space in the center right away. Dealing with
for the lower branches, then do it now as opposed to wait for the spring?
No, you can wait till the spring for
Okay.
all the cuts.
Yep.
In dealing with your branches further up top, they look great. It's setting the initial structure here. You just kind of want to coax that along. If you have a very, very long piece of wood, feel free to use a heading cut on that to reduce the height and encourage more branching. At this point, you shouldn't be concerned necessarily about fruit. You should be concerned about making sure that you're picking branches that are in the right spot for you, that are setting other lateral branches. Like this little guy here isn't going to stay small forever. Maybe that's going to be another important lateral branch as time goes on. So you just want to make sure that you're training your branches into the right shape. If it's too vertical for you, you can use a tie down to the ground perhaps. Yeah, and just making sure this is a great example of using a lot of heading cuts to get more branching and more branch strength while the tree's still young.
Kate, can I just jump in quickly to clarify? Are you, the cuts that you're suggesting here are based on the sort of central leader and lateral branch structure, not the goblet or like open
I think
structure?
this is open. This looks like open bush to me, like it's already
Okay.
there. But that could just be the photo angle. Bill, is this like central leader that's just a bit droopy, or is this are you trying to make a vase shape?
I don't know what I'm doing, honestly. I think of it more as a vase shape.
Okay, great. Yeah, go with that. And just try and make your heading cuts, you know, to outward facing buds, and thinking of these little guys as your future skeleton, rather. You know, this one, I don't know what's going on with this. I don't really, this branch feels like it starts very low and comes up quite high. Maybe a branch that you either take off and focus on making your vase further up the tree.
Just a quick follow-up to that, Kate, like at the bottom of the branch that you had highlighted blue, if
Mhm.
that were, for instance, if that were crossing over the middle of another part of your vase outside shape, would you still leave that? Like, how do you address crossing when it happens in a open bush shape like that? If it's really low down?
If it's really low down, well, if it's a young tree and it's low, I mean, you don't necessarily want crossing branches on young trees, because that's gonna set the stage. They're gonna grow into that shape and size, so it's not desirable. There's so much, you know, growth hormone coursing through these trees that you could probably cut it to a bud that's facing in a desirable direction, and it would send out another shoot the way you want it to go. So that's a strong possibility were this branch to be going the wrong way. The other thing is that, you know, maybe it's a tie down situation. Maybe you can pull the branch gently for a season, you know, where you want it to be.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, let's take a quick look at the peach. Oh yeah. And I gotta share this. Okay, great. Can you guys all see this?
Yep.
Do you have any questions particularly about your peach, Bill? No. Okay, well, I won't say too much about peaches, except that they're a real challenge to grow. And I thought it would be interesting to take a little look at this to see, you know, what's going on. This looks like it has really good airflow, you know, good scaffolding here, another main branch here. Looks like there's good spacing between these key branches. So that's a great start. The tricky thing about peaches, you know, and some of the stone fruit is that they're not like apples, in the sense that apples will get that fruit spur and they'll go for year after year after year on the same spur. And these Mediterranean style fruits are more likely to produce their blossoms on the oldest first year wood and on second year wood. And then that's sort of it. And so the older the wood gets, like older wood here and here, the less productive it is. So you just, with these kinds of fruit, you have to make sure that you're using renewal cuts. So thinning cuts, bigger thinning cuts, occasionally, in order to encourage young wood where you want it. So you always have to be making sure you have a selection of young wood when it comes to peaches. And also relevant for figs too. You always have to make sure you have a selection of young wood. The old wood is essentially not productive. And these are very sensitive trees, so I would not prune them in the dead of winter. I would prune them as late as possible or on the warmest spring day you can find. And once they're mature, I would switch to summer pruning for a lot of these types of trees, the Mediterranean style trees, because it's so much less damaging for them.
Kate, I don't know if nobody else has submitted a fig photo, but I just put one in the chat if you wanted to talk specifically about it. It's not the greatest quality in terms of the light, but other than that, the last photo that anyone has submitted is, well, Bill also submitted an apple photo, and then there's an Asian pear photo a little bit later on. But if you wanted to stay on the theme of fig, I just put one in the chat for you if you want to talk about that.
Nice, nice, nice. Yeah, okay, all I'm gonna say about figs is that Bob and Verna Duncan of Fruit Trees and More have this really great YouTube video about how to prune a fig. And I think you guys should watch that if you have questions about figs. Yeah, I mean, you can see that from the pruning here too. This has been pruned so that it's all young wood and really reachable wood.
We can't actually see if you're trying to share the fig yet.
You're right, haven't done that. Here we go. So with the fig, you're seeing all this is young wood, and it's been pruned here regularly. That's the, the structure of the tree, and this is the young fruiting wood up here, and it's being pruned like that. When you watch Bob and Verna's YouTube video on figs, they'll make it a little bit more clear, but that's what you want to aim for with figs all the time. Thanks for that photo, Erica. That was great. Okay, let's take a quick look at that Asian pear and then we might wrap it up. Depends if there's any more questions or.
Yeah, the question specific to this was, is pruning an Asian pear the same as any other pear? From Wendy Northcutt.
Pretty similar. Pretty similar in the sense that you deal with a lot of the same things, such as fruiting spurs happening on the older wood. They have very similar levels of hardiness, and they also have very similar tendencies for shoots, like up here. So in this particular case,
we can still just see the.
Oh gosh. I keep forgetting to do that part. I think it's time for a cup of coffee. Okay, this will take a second and then it should come through. Wendy, did you have any questions about this espalier?
I guess I'm looking at the top branches, and you can see even from the lower branches, I tried to weigh it down so that I'm getting good scaffolding there.
Yeah.
Do I trim the what to me look like water sprouts? Do I cut those back up there?
How tall do you want the tree in the end?
I don't want it any taller than 6 feet.
Is that 6 feet?
That's about 5.5 there.
Yeah, and your scaffolding seems to end there, doesn't it? Like your
Right.
trellising seems to end at that 5 foot mark.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, the thing to do here is it looks like it's a young tree that's still setting into place. So it looks like a combination of winter and summer pruning, in the sense that you can use summer pruning to cut out the shoots that you don't want and that you don't want to grow back. This is espalier, and this is espalier are typically highly managed. So you can come back to the tree and do many small adjustments several times a year in the spring and in the summer. This is espalier trees, and young trees are where I'd make the exception. It's okay probably to prune once or twice in the year because you're managing every precise little thing about espalier trees. So in the summer, Wendy, just cut off the branches that you don't want. You get to decide what height you want them at. And what I would do is in the winter time, use winter cuts. So now pruning now, wherever you're going to finish pruning, to help encourage more growth so that the tree continues to fill out the space that you're setting for it.
Okay, great, thank you.
And leave lots of fruit spurs and leave more branches than you think you need, because then you can choose which ones look best at a later date.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So cute. Oh, Asian pear, what kind is it?
It's a multi. There's about five different varieties on it.
Delish.
We've had production on it. They're just not really large, so that's what I'm trying to maybe try to focus on, getting them to be larger fruit rather than a bunch of little small ones.
Yeah, and that'll come with time too, for sure.
Okay.
Nice.
Hey, there was one more, thanks, Wendy. There was one question in the chat that refers to, it doesn't have a picture, but it's from Adina, and she says, I don't have a picture, but I have about a 3-year-old plum. It is about 6 feet tall. I would say it is a vase shape with 4 nice laterals, but a very prominent central leader that basically goes from where the other branches start, but straight up. Do I cut it off right where it starts and make it a true vase shape?
I think I might just scroll up and try and read some of that myself. Oh, here we go. Yeah, well, Adina, I mean, I think in this case, if you're happy with that vase shape with the nice laterals, then absolutely take control of the tree and prune out, you know, the verticals that aren't serving you. Especially in plums, they can be very vertical. Okay, that's my answer for that. I see Melanie has one. Is it necessary to spray fruit trees? It's not necessary. That's the short answer. You can, if you wish. There are some common sprays used for backyard, and I would just say, you know, really educate yourself on what the specific spray does before you get into that. I mean, management and sprays are kind of like a whole nother topic. One really common one is people can spray dormant oil, or you know, that's probably the most common backyard spray. But dormant oil isn't gonna impact scab or some of those visual issues that folks are concerned about. Dormant oil is basically a smothering action on any overwintering bugs or larvae in and around your bark. So you have to really coat your tree really, really well. And you have to catch all those eggs and things that are overwintering on the leaves and bark in order for it to be effective. So that would be one place where I just suggest you really look into the sprays and exactly what they do, because it may be that they don't actually tackle the problem that you're worried about necessarily. I also don't personally think that sprays are super effective at the backyard level. I think they're a little bit of a hassle when good pruning and good yard care can be just as effective. You know, one thing that I would say that is maybe more effective than spraying even for overall tree health is raking up your leaves at the end of November, sometimes even mid-December. Rake up your leaves from the ground and compost them off of your property or burn them if you can. That basically just having a clean orchard floor is great in the sense that it's going to reduce the areas where pests and disease overwinter. So not having leaves under your trees is actually really effective against things like scab and anthracnose. Yeah, great. I see there's one more thing, one more raised hand here. Ask to unmute. Oh, great.
Hi. I have an odd question. I purchased a Gravenstein from Jane in 2000 and planted it here in my orchard on Thetis Island. And it got a very weird, bad disease. It split the the trunk split and bark peeled off. So I cut it off. This is about 15 years ago or 10 years ago. I cut it out and I dug up the root and left the space. And then I got, I guess about 6 years ago, I got a whip coming up and I left it because I was curious. And I get apples off it, and they're not Gravenstein. So I'm not sure which rootstock it was. And how would I figure that out, or should I take it out again, or what?
Have you tried the fruit? What does it taste like?
Yeah, it's not great, but I don't know about cider, you know.
Yeah.
So it's I haven't tested it for acidity, but actually they get tastier every year, and of course the deer love them when I save them for deer. So, but it's weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of interesting because apples and most, you know, home fruit trees are grafted. The exception that I can think of right now is figs, but almost everything else is grafted onto rootstock, and these rootstock have been developed, you know, pretty highly developed in the last 200 years at scientific research stations. And what they are is they're typically crosses of crabapple and another type of fruit, another type of apple that confers certain traits the scientists were hoping for. And so they are trees, they are fruit. They just were never selected for taste. So sometimes they're awful. But I mean, they'll be standard. So if your rootstock is growing, it'll be standard seedling size. So it'll get to 20, 25 feet in the end, and it won't really have a maximum lifespan, maybe 100, 150 years, like some of the biggest seedlings out there. Unless it's a dwarf rootstock, in which case it'll have a shorter lifespan. Yeah, that's so interesting. I always love stories like that. You can cut it down and graft onto it, just leave it be.
Oh, it was semi-dwarf, and you're right. It does. The fruit is the size of a Wixon crab, so maybe that's, you know, it's crabbing more than it is appling. I don't know, but yeah, I'll keep looking at it and see what it is.
Probably great for cider.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in from Thetis Island. Wow.
Oh no, yeah, no, I'm always interested. I used to work there, so yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, Sheila, and then maybe we'll call this the last question.
I'm just wanted to talk about the biennial fruit bearers. When the June drop comes, and if you thin your fruit, when you've got a year with lots of fruit, thin them to 2 fruitlets per cluster and about a foot apart. That's if you can reach them. It'll reduce the crop on the full year, and the next year you will get a better crop. So that the tree isn't totally stressed in its producing year.
Mhm.
That's one way of combating it. As I wouldn't recommend cutting any fruit spurs off at all.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for saying that more concisely.
And the other thing is I do recommend cleaning pruners between cuts. And you can do that with a bleach solution, or actually I usually use a rubbing alcohol on a rag. And this will help to prevent disease spreading when you do some of your cuts. Thanks.
Mhm. Sheila, I have a little bit more of a pragmatic approach in that I tend to think disease will be endemic in your own backyard. If it's on one tree, it's probably already on the other. But I really agree with Sheila's point, and it's something I wish I mentioned earlier, is that you should be cleaning your tools, especially if you're going between properties, between trees, or if you cut out a piece of diseased wood, clean your tools with rubbing alcohol before going around to the rest of your trees. Really great piece of sort of sanitation, tree sanitation there that's going to help with healthy trees. Yeah, thank you so much, you guys. This was wonderful. And Erica, thank you for keeping me on track and pulling up some of those photos. And to Danny for hosting and organizing as well.
And thanks to the GPA and to Dylan and Brad for setting up the website. And maybe Danny was going to say this, but I sort of seem to have taken over the host role. So hopefully she doesn't feel like her feet are being stepped on, but I think
my toes are fine.
This webinar will be, it's been recorded and it will be posted on the GPA site. So if you want to share it with people who might have missed it, then they can check that out later.
Do you want to say a little bit about next week as well?
Why don't you do that, Danny?
Since you're going to host it, I thought.
Oh,
maybe you could.
I guess I could. Sure. Yeah. Okay. We've got Plan Bean doing a webinar, and I don't actually know who from Plan Bean. It might be a couple of people will be hosting it, but this is a project on Denman where a group is trying to increase sort of food security and resilience by growing beans. So tune in next time. I won't say too much more than that, but it should be really interesting.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kate, because I felt like this was a really good talk, really useful.
Thanks for inviting me. It was my pleasure.